Thank you very much for inviting us, and thank you everybody for being here. It's a pleasure to be with you, and really a great treat to be in a meeting like this. I think there are both advantages and disadvantages to being the very last roundtable, but for sure there's been a lot of discussion about what is uncertainty. But when we think about education and uncertainty, a desired outcome of education would be to be able to take advantage of it and to address uncertainty. In part to have some control over uncertainty, but equally important would be for education to enable people to recognize and take advantage of the opportunities that uncertainty offers. I'm going to just very briefly address some of these ideas about what is it that makes us civil society, and then look at the experience of Educate a Child, the program that I direct, in terms of working with a range of civil society organizations to enable millions of out-of-school children to get a quality primary education. And from that, I want to touch briefly on the need to define education quality in a much broader and more comprehensive way than we currently do it. And then perhaps make some modest suggestions for consideration for the research program. I think I'm embarrassed to talk about civil society with you here, sir, but there's certainly...
we all learn on the job and then we lose our jobs.
I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what is meant by civil society. It's a term with many, many definitions and probably even more perceptions. But ultimately, we are all part of civil society. If you vote, you're part of civil society. If you participate in a voluntary group, you're part of civil society. If you go shopping, you're part of civil society. So essentially, we're all civil society. But more important is how we use our status as civil society and how our various civil society statuses are used. Too often, when defining groups as civil society, we begin, although unintentionally, to focus on differences, which often makes understanding and working with civil society so difficult. What we must work with civil society, we have to do it, and we have to make it work for us, because it is us. And as Dr. Johnson said in the very opening, it's the heartbeat of society, so I think that's a really important notion to go forward with. In Educate a Child, we made a conscious decision to focus on non-governmental organizations as key to our overall strategy. We launched in November of 2012, and we set out to enable 10 million out-of-school children enroll in a primary education program. This April, we, along with our partners, met in New York to celebrate those commitments to enroll the 10 million children, and already 7 million are actually in school and learning. This was ambitious for sure, but we knew that if we wanted to convince the world that we can break the back of an intractable, what's perceived as an intractable education problem, we have to do it at scale. Plus, in 2012, there were 61 million out-of-school children at the primary level alone. Anything that was not at scale would not be taken seriously and would not make a difference. So we knew we had to get attention somehow. We did this through what we consider to be a fairly innovative partnership model that is implemented in 71 projects across 50 countries. How did we do this? We really focused on principles. So we used the rights-based approach. We work in partnership, recognizing that today's problems are too complex for one organization to tackle on its own. Fundamental was recognizing that knowledge is generated everywhere. Local folks probably know what will work well in the local context. We build on what exists. We don't reinvent the wheel. What we do is we take programs and take them to scale. Using the rights-based approach, we address the barriers that children face. We don't see the children as the problem. We see the barriers as the problem. and recognize that there are probably multiple solutions to a single barrier. There's not one size fits all, there's no one answer. We require our partners to have skin in the game, and we do that through a co-funding model. We insist on strong monitoring evaluation, which drives the number of our partners mad. And I think finally, it's focus. Ours is out-of-school children at the primary level. We have focused. So when we think about primary education, I think it's important to understand how critical it is, especially in times of uncertainty. First, primary is the foundation for all subsequent levels of education. Without a solid foundation, success at other levels and pathways to additional learning are usually much more difficult. And it's not just reading, writing, and arithmetic. Stephanie Jones spoke to the need for the skills for the future in the first 10 years, noting self-control, social competencies, and people skills. We're talking the primary level here. However, there's more to the importance of primary. We need to face the fact that with growing young populations, especially in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and the Middle East, it is quite probable that millions upon millions will probably have their formal education, as we know it, limited to primary. This is why primary education is vital and has to change. It has to be more flexible, and it has to address the learning needs of the future. Primary education must provide the foundation for being able to learn throughout life. We call it different things. We call it education for sustainable development, life skills, 21st century skills, but we know what it must address. It must address knowledge, competencies and skills, attitudes and behaviors, and values. That was put forward very, very articulately this morning. In particular, we need to look at the values and skills that prepare young people for a life of change, a life of diversity, possible adversity, and a life of unknowns. But they need to be able to see this as opportunity and the chance to improve their well-being by taking advantage of the opportunity. So for us then, the quality education is one that understands the past, is relevant to the future, and is relevant to the present, and has a view to the future. We can't just look forward, we have to learn from what has passed. Quality education relates to knowledge building and the skillful application of all forms of knowledge by unique individuals who function both independently and in relation to others. A quality education reflects the dynamic nature of culture and language, the value of the individual in relation to the larger context, and the importance of living in a way that promotes equality in the present and fosters a sustainable future. If we think about that as quality, we then realize that a lot of what is being measured and a lot of what is being looked at in terms of SDG 4 is actually not very relevant. So here are just a few questions for the research team to consider. It would be important to focus on the diversity of learning needs and not just the average child's learning needs. Second, to look at the ways young children recognize and respond to opportunity and build on that. Third, to focus on the most disadvantaged, work with the bottom quartile or quintile of a class. Fourth, analyze what's working. Have a lot of flexibility so that if something's not working, you can let it go. I'm going to come back to the focus on the disadvantaged. How does a school project do this? When there are now 63 million out-of-school children at the primary level, more than twice that at the secondary level, how is a schools project going to address the most disadvantaged? So one way to do that might be to look at does the school seek out learners? Does it try to get those disadvantaged children in rather than just waiting to see who shows up? And secondly, is the school truly inclusive in terms of everything it does? And finally, I would ask the team to remember that what you count is what counts. So it is very careful. You need to be very careful about what you actually measure, because these are the research questions to which policy members will respond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. Our order on the program has Jasmina, Haynes from Integrity Action next. So are you fine to go?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So Jasmina is with Integrity Action, and she will tell you a little bit more about what they do. I learned a little bit about the organization, and I recall it's fascinating. Really amazing methodology to reach students. But before joining Integrity Action, Jasmina spent about 15 years focusing on poverty reduction in Africa, the Balkans, and Asia. And has an academic background in law and internal audit, so perfect. So with that, would you like to, you had a video you wanted to show Rebecca?
Yes, and we have tested it early on and it worked.
Oh,
hopefully it works this time.
Maybe it'll work now for us too. We've been having
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Jayne, and it's such a great pleasure to speak to all of you, and it has been incredibly fascinating day and a half, and hopefully I can add a little bit more to all of that. So going back to the original question from how do we build pluralistic societies that are inclusive and prosperous and cosmopolitan? At Integrity Action, we believe that such societies are only possible if they are built upon very strong values that are lived and practiced by the majority. And hint is in the title, we do focus on integrity building. And what we want to see is citizens being able to demand integrity and also behaving in line with integrity values. What reality for loads of young people is that living with integrity doesn't really pay off. So teaching integrity when they're observing around them that teachers are asking for bribes and getting away with it, that politicians are going unpunished for whatever they do, that celebrities can behave whichever way they pretty much choose to, and it's all forgotten in a day or two. What is the incentive to really be this virtuous person who will say, no, I'm not going to take your bribe once they grow up? And how can we support them to gain trust first and foremost, that by demanding integrity something will change for better? So that's the framework, and now I would like to show you a video, because Asmita says it all a lot better than I do. Asmita is one of our monitors. If we could have a video now, would that be okay?
This is yours, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, should I click on it?
Yeah.
Okay.
आधी चाहिँ हराइसकेको हुन्छ बिचबिचमा उनीहरूले नै राखिसकेका हुन्छ भने त्यहाँ ठेकेदारसँग आइपुग्दा पनि ठेकेदारबाट एकदम कच्चा सामानको प्रयोग गरी पक्की भवन निर्माण नहुने जस्तो भए पनि त्यस्तो सामानहरू प्रयोग गरेर भवन निर्माण भएको हुन्छ अनि ठेकेदारले बढी नाफा लिने गर्दछ यस्तो नहोस् भ्रष्टाचार नहोस् भ्रष्टाचारको नियन्त्रण होस् र पक्की भवन निर्माण होस् भनेर पारदर्शिता ल्याउनको लागि चाहिँ एकदम अनुगमनको आवश्यकता छ यो मैले म आफैले अनुगमन गरिरहेको बेला चाहिँ मलाई एकदम रमाइलो महसुस भएको छ किनभने आफ्नो गाउँमा यस्तो भ्रष्टाचारलाई नियन्त्रण गर्ने अनि पारदर्शिता ल्याउने सदाचारिता ल्याउने यस्तो काममा.
So, what Jasmina is talking about is they have monitored school infrastructure projects. She's one of Integrity Club members in Nepal. So within these clubs, students are supported to learn about integrity and then very importantly to monitor the quality of education services delivered to them. And I have another slide to very briefly tell you how it works. I think it will be a little bit clearer. So what happens here is that young people through teachers are invited to join integrity clubs. Integrity clubs now exist in every single school in DR Congo, for example. We normally arrive to countries on invitation by the government and respond to appetite of local partners. Teachers normally, we don't pay teachers to do this. They have to do it because they're passionate about integrity, and normally the ones who raise their hands and say, yes, we will support this club, are the best performing teachers. And they do it because they want to support young people to learn about integrity, to do something that's fun and gives them those lifelong skills, but also indirectly to address some of the big meaty issues that are persistent in schools that they can't tackle head on, like their colleague turning up to work drunk, and things like that. So young people will, over a couple of weeks, learn within the club about integrity values, and then what we do is we have design technology tool, and we provide technology unless they have mobile phones, and what they will do is upload findings, whether water is running in the toilets, whether school is accessible to everybody. They monitor basic things that are guaranteed in constitution or guaranteed by the education system. We don't ask them for their subjective view on such things. They will also report back on quality of education and points that they respond to, other points that they agree with headmaster and teachers, and sometimes it will include happiness, being happy, being motivated to learn, and all the rest. What happens as they upload findings is that our platform is open and it's in real time and it's visible to everybody. We hope that by doing that we incentivize better performance, and what normally happens is that headmasters and teachers will feel very uncomfortable with it. They will regroup students and parents, and then what happens is kind of negotiation. How do we now fix this? Sometimes school will not have money to pay for running water, but by bringing people back in the room, they can negotiate with parents if they can donate small amounts, what are the appropriate amounts, and etc. What we are very focused on is this part here. What we don't believe in is that it does good to anyone if we just bring all these problems to the surface, because people will suddenly be aware of things that they previously didn't know, and they will leave even more disheartened. We focus on fixing identified problems. Within our methodology, we call it the fix rate. It's number of problems resolved versus number of problems identified. And currently within education programs across 6 countries, including Congo, Afghanistan, Palestine, fixed rate is at about 47%, and we're incredibly proud of that. Through this approach, about $1 billion worth of value projects have been monitored, so it's not insignificant. What happens as problems are fixed? The environment changes. It changes immediately, and that incentivizes young people to see tangible value from their actions, and that's incredibly important. If things didn't change, you lose them, and then you further feed into this picture of ordinary person can't fix it. This is just how the world is. What Jasmina spoke about is, as they build their skills and knowledge of monitoring within schools, then we want them to graduate and begin to monitor projects that are of importance within the community. Because what we have learned is for young people to really act with the integrity and demand integrity, this needs to be recognized as a socially valuable behavior. And before I finish, I'm just going to leave you with a couple of questions. We pride ourselves to be very focused on pursuing answers to carefully selected questions, and I'm just hoping that some of these might come of value to this broader research. First one is, what are the ways to build trusted channels, and trust is incredibly important here, where all children are active agents of developing sustainable education system? Second question is, if channels are built, will they incentivize better performance by institutions? And then thirdly, if improvements are generated and sustained, will they, and if yes, how, do they convert into wider community benefit? And in our thinking, that's how we get to societies that are plural, cosmopolitan, prosperous, and inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmina. Wow, that's really inspiring. I have lots of questions for you, but I'm going to put them on hold, and I love your questions. Next, we would like to hear from Lucia Fry, who manages the Malala Fund's program of research and policy analysis, which underpins your advocacy work and thought leadership on girls' education in the countries in which you were active. Lucia joined Malala Fund from ActionAid, where she led their policy work on women's and girls' rights. And previously, Lucia held senior roles at the Global Campaign for Education, at Plan, and at Volunteer Services Overseas.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Are we afternoon? Yes,
we are.
I'm sure many of you are familiar with our founder, Malala, one of our co-founders, Malala, but you may be less familiar with the work of Malala Fund. So I'll just give a brief introduction to that, and then I'm going to reflect on 3 ways in which I think an organisation like Malala Fund, explicitly a change-making organisation, can contribute positively in a world of uncertainty. So Malala Fund's an organisation. We were founded by Malala herself and her father Ziauddin Yousafzai, and we have a mission to ensure that every girl can have a free, safe, quality education for 12 years, with a particular focus on poor and marginalised community. And we're explicitly oriented towards effecting social and political change, mainly through supporting national organisations and the people who work for them. And the support we give them helps them to pioneer scalable models in girls' education, influence social norms around women and girls and education, and advocate for specific changes at local, subnational and national levels. And then the fund complements this work with advocacy at the international and global level, led by the founders. So basically, as you can tell, we see the process of effecting change in education as inherently political. And it's probably worth mentioning, as it probably was clear, but that we don't do direct programming. We don't have Malala Fund staff on the ground, but work with national and local CSOs. And so you could say that our job is to create uncertainty in equal measure as it is to navigate it, depending on where you're sitting. So, as I say, I came up with sort of 3 elements of this role, the role of a change-making education organisation in a world of uncertainty. I don't expect it's an exhaustive list. It probably stems from the fact that I've been with the fund only 8 months, but it's the things that struck me in my 8 months with the organisation. So one of them is to anticipate and preferably mitigate or maximise the opportunity of uncertainties with particular respect to the left behind. I think we see these big global trends, our colleague from OECD presented them, and perfectly understandably, we kind of see the mass impact, the aggregate mass impact of the global trends. We also need to, in the era of the SDGs, indeed, need to think about the left behind. And the one that is in Malala Fund sites at the moment is the future of work. It's become the hottest topic of the moment. It's high on the agenda of the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, and the G20. AI, automation, and the digital economy look set to remake the labour market and have ripple effects into wider society. What's that got to do with girls' education is the question we asked ourselves. Well, in a world where new technologies offer both promise and peril, in the labour market, the ability of young people to use technologies, but also to create and innovate, to relate and cooperate, will come more and more to the fore. The accessibility, quality, and I would argue the gender responsiveness or the gender transformativeness, a bit of a mouthful of syllables, but of education is key. And just to give a little snapshot stat to make you think about that, a girl with a secondary education is 6 times more likely to be online than a girl with primary or below. That's why we're doing a new advocacy and research work stream on this issue. We'll be engaging stakeholders from the tech sector to local communities, exploring the readiness of education systems to adapt to this new world of work, and looking very much at the gender dimension. So we want to know how are these trends affecting poor and marginalised girls? Are they affected, or are they so left behind as to be kind of untouched? I mean, as Mary Joy said, even achieving minimum learning results for poor and marginalised girls in developing countries at primary level is still a step challenge. So, are these issues relevant to them at all? Will they find themselves locked out of the Kersal Keep as a lucky few run in and pull up the drawbridge behind them? Or will it create opportunity, making connections to a wider world of employment and enabling more flexible forms of work? So that's the anticipation part. Then there's helping educators and students to weather uncertain times. We're currently considering programme expansion to Latin America, and as part of this I went to Brazil a few weeks ago. I haven't been for 10 years. Quite a lot's changed. And not in a good way. Basically, the experience of Brazil is an object lesson in the reality that the road to justice is not a one-way highway. So after years of progress in education, pioneering programmes in education, the recent change of government, widely regarded, I would say, by civil society, even quite conservative elements of civil society, as a bureaucratic coup, has ushered in two things that mainly strike one around education: the extreme austerity programme, which has been signed into law in a constitutional amendment, and the rise of social conservatism stoked up by some of the more socially conservative parties. And this has created a movement called School Without Parties, ironically run by political parties, and it's calling for an end to teaching to what they term gender ideology. So basically a lot of progress was made introducing gender into the Common Core in Brazil, and it's now been, they're calling for an end to it. Teachers are being scrutinised and harassed and abused, and in some cases physically attacked for teaching around these issues. There are also calls for repeal of provisions for minority ethnic communities, which have been seen as a big step forward. So the CSOs we met there were in defensive mode. They're digging in to defend hard-won gains in education financing and in the content and processes of education, and to protect teachers. They were stepping up their game to provide education for marginalised girls and young women. They were supporting social mobilisation by education activists, LGBTQ activists and feminist activists, and they were using innovative approaches, tech methods among them. They were holding politicians to account, and they were engaging some unlikely allies, elements of the private sector and the judiciary in their efforts. So that, I think, is another area. It's helping to weather uncertainty. And then the final bit, as I kind of alluded to in the beginning, I think the role of civil society is sometimes to disrupt certainties. The work of our founders in their former life in Pakistan exemplifies this element of civil society work. They challenged social norms and took on conservative forces. They did not accept the inevitable. They refused to submit to the certainty of patriarchal values about girls' education, women's rights and empowerment. They did not accept the status quo, and they continue to challenge it to this day. The work of our, where's my little leaflet, Gul Mackay network continues in this vein. Gul Mackay was Malala's pen name when she was a blogger for the BBC. So this programme is our signature programme, and it identifies local champions, future Malalas, if you know, who are working to advance girls' education in some of the most challenging places on earth. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nigeria. They include, for example, Naila in Lebanon, who's developing STEM e-learning for Syrian refugee girls. Rotimi in Nigeria, who's created an online platform to engage young people in social change and raise awareness of Nigeria's Child Rights Act, and has succeeded with allies in getting the state of Kaduna to domesticate the Child Rights Act. Yeah. Zaland in Afghanistan, who from his position at Safa Radio is producing segments of broadcast aimed at countering negative perceptions about girls' education. And I could give other examples of disrupting certainties. Oxfam's recent work on inequalities disrupted the certainty that inequality is inevitable. Pratam in India, with the ASA program, testing learning at household level, disrupted the certainty that enrolment would indeed lead on to quality outcomes and so on. And an example that I love from my former employers at ActionAid, they supported a program in Nepal looking at the unpaid care burden that women were carrying. And it's very uneven in Nepal. Women are doing 5 times more unpaid care work than men, and of course that impacts on their ability to do paid work. They can only do informal, flexible, precarious forms of paid work, which has an impact on household income and so on. And so they did work with time use diaries for the women to identify the disparities in unpaid care work. And the women were a bit shocked when they realised this disparity and when they perceived it as work. And so they came up with the idea of their own campaign called Burn the Curry, and agreed within a network of villages one night that they would all burn the curry on the same night so that they could demonstrate their value to their households and their menfolk. And it prompted much discussion in community circles and religious groups and so on. So I love that one. What does civil society bring to the table? CSOs can be nimble, where systems are rigid. They can take risks and learn from failure, where the incentives in systems are all about succeeding at scale. They can stand with the poor and marginalised. They can notice them when others don't. They can bring their voices to the global debates. They can operate at multiple levels where others may be constrained by hierarchies. I remember going to Brussels once and meeting with the cabinet and European Commissioner, and then I met a friend of mine who was employed by the Commission. She was like, "You must be joking, I would never meet people in the cabinet because I can't operate at that level. I'm stuck in where I am in my hierarchy." And as Malala's experience shows, civil society can gather and tell the stories that can move hearts and change minds.
I can Yeah, this is a tough act to follow, but we have sort of a late addition to our panel and that I'm really excited about. Michael Gibbons with Wellspring Philanthropic Fund has agreed to say a few words to this issue. Michael is director of the International Education and Global Children's Rights Programs at Wellspring Philanthropic Fund. And has worked in basic education, community development, and social justice since about the mid-70s, across countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and specializes in basic and non-formal education, child rights, child development, adult learning processes, training of educators, and organizational learning. Dr. Gibbons.
Thanks very much. It's really fun to be part of this group and hopefully participate in a good discussion together. I'll just offer a few final words. All three of these presentations have been very eloquent expressions of different ways of thinking about the civic and democratic promise of education and the responsibility for education. You know, we think of it as a human right, we think of it as a state responsibility, we frame it in big global goal frameworks and so on. And yet it's maybe one of the most important opportunities for democratic practice in every society, because it's one of the few places where the machinery of large-scale government service and ordinary citizens' action intersect. Mm-hmm. It's also the first place when a child is born in a country, all of us believe that they're born with all of their full human rights. And so school is the first place that a child encounters the state. It's usually a local neighborhood school, preschool or kindergarten or first grade. She walks down the lane holding her mother's hand. She opens the gate and she moves from home in the neighborhood into the arms of something that is the duty bearer for rights. And if that goes well, we are socializing a child to believe in rights, to believe in governance, to believe in their country's policies and systems of self-governance. And then we have something we can all build on. But that encounter can be very different. You can open that gate and you can walk into a place that's ruled by corporal punishment, threats of violence as a form of social control, a place where I'm ignored if I'm this kind of child or that kind of child, where as a result of that, the social dynamics of other children are affected negatively. And then that child walks home thinking, that's government. And then we get what we get. We get this mass scale socialization to a different vision of what I should fear and what I should love and respect. And so my own invitation to our conversation is to think about the critical importance of this encounter between the state, the family, and the child. This is a moment, and it happens in the millions every day around the world. It's the form, or it's the driver, the creator of the social norms, the belief systems that children bring into the world for the rest of their lives. It sets the idea that we're either working with our prefrontal cortex or the amygdala in the driver's seat when we think about rights and we think about governing, we think about being a citizen. And we're not doing a good job of ensuring that one of those stories is the story we want to unfold on its massive scale. It's also, think of the opportunity here. I mean, what is larger scale than that? there is no larger scale socializer to human rights and civic culture and values. The values of pluralism, the values that we think are the main sheet anchor in times of uncertainty. But we're not maximizing that opportunity. We don't think about the possibilities of education for all as the possibility of planting the seeds of democracy all over the world. Democracy, not American foreign policy objectives, not democracy is defined by anybody else but citizens in their own spaces, how we are reflected in our own government. This is what we all yearn for. This is what waves of youth activists around the world over my lifetime and my parents' lifetime have sought. What did young people who led the independence movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America want? Their rallying cry was freedom first, school second. I give up my education to fight for my independence. And then those youth movements were poisoned and appropriated in early stages of the state building process. This happened in the Arab Spring. This has happened in my generation in the 1968 youth movement to fight the Vietnam War and problems like that. But in place of that is this amazing opportunity to build on the possibility of making this encounter between the child and the state one that fosters a deep belief that we can co-construct visions that we want. So I want to share with you just two key ideas. Wellspring Philanthropic Fund is a private funder devoted to social justice and human rights. We're anonymous by design. We're not interested in being known about. We're interested in supporting activism around human rights and social justice and the focus on the activist. So I'm the director of Children's Rights and the Right to Education programs, which are two of the 12 programs of human rights work at Wellspring Advisor. We work very closely in the world of Action Aid, Dollar Fund, and we think of ourselves as a friend of processes like the Integrity Project and Mary Joy's work and the work of Educate a Child, championing the right to education and extending it to those that are kind of structurally left out in a large scale. But I have a critique to offer. I fully agree with you that CSOs have this promise of being able to do all of the things you mentioned. But we also have been not always at our best. And one of the challenges that we've identified in human rights work over the last 4 or 5 years and became very real with recent elections and recent political trends is that disembodied, elite-led advocacy is a very limited, very superficial approach to social change. And much of the education advocacy I've devoted my entire life to, the human rights advocacy that we all been part of, has inched in the direction of being too Western, white, male, elite-led for too long. You go to a global meeting about human rights or education advocacy, who do you see? You see like 40 of me. And we're all the same dudes that have been doing it for 40 years. David and I are laugh and cry about this all the time. David Archie. So something has to change there, and we need several things. So that's one. This critique needs challenging. The other thing I would say is that we are under assault. The idea of human rights, the ideas represented by the SDGs, are under assault. They're stated, but the lived reality is a fundamental challenge to those. So these turbulent times that we are in, this new phase of turbulent times. I was born in the early 50s, just after World War II, where we were cleaning up the mess of the Great Depression, World War I, World War II, as a result of a fear-inducing set of turbulent circumstances that gave rise to a whole set of cataclysms. We're entering a new stage where the amygdala is driving everything, and those that know how to manipulate the amygdala, know how to manipulate fear, demagogues, are leading us. And citizens themselves are fearful. That's how we see the world now. We think about security, we think about terrorism, we think that, as opposed to thinking about the gate swinging open and all these possibilities unfolding, potential human capacity. So we need to reclaim, and there's a narrative that drove that change. It's a sinister narrative, but it is expert, and it is systematic. And think tanks, social media use, the use of all of the different new technologies of communicating on a mass scale to citizens are expertly used by those that press on the amygdala. We're not doing that well. We have to reclaim a narrative that centers on our moral imagination. So I want to go in the direction of practices that build on integrity action, on our Malala Fund tactics and strategies, how we engage citizens in reclaiming agency and making the demands that when the school gate swings open, we want certain things to happen. And also this appeal to a kind of new, broad, big moral image of a moral imagination that we can, all advocates can claim and can be missionaries of, as opposed to kind of competitors about. I wonder if you could just pull up that image for me. So one direction is the idea of how we restore ownership, buy-in, and agency in an era of fear. People, we heard yesterday and today that we're paralyzed when we're fearful. We are led to inaction. So I wonder if you could just flip it to the next one.
The next one. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. But we're flipped into inaction, frozen, fearful. We look for strong leaders, quote unquote, to fix things in an era, driven by fear. And so the antidote to that is to encourage, as the Integrity Project does, this kind of process, self-directed process of action reflection that builds confidence in agency, civic agency, in the most practical way, person by person, group by group. So we need to reestablish among those of us that champion these ideas an old set of practices that had been forgotten or fallen asleep to a great extent. Malala, Action Aid, and some folks practice them well, but by and large, this has become a technocratic exercise. What we need is to engage in social norms dialogue sensitively at local level. But the we is not an outsider to a community like me, outside of my neighborhood of working class New York City where I grew up. That's where I'm part of the we. That's where I could engage in social norms dialogue. We need to support the recognition of and the building of norms around indigenous knowledge and shared humanistic local values. So we don't start with the global norms. We don't say, hello, I'm here to talk to you about the Convention on the Rights of the Child in neighborhoods in Nepal or in Kibera in Nairobi. You start with an open question. What does dignity mean here? Who are you? What do you care? What are you worried about for your children? How do you express cherishing your children? How is their dignity expressed? And then you begin connecting and weaving. So there's a good example of an organization in West Africa called Tostan, which does this. It's a patient human rights dialogue education program that trains local facilitators in 14 different African languages to foster dialogue about the meaning of human rights and justice using local language terms and using the Quran. So I was just at a training of theirs where they had Quranic leaders from all over West Africa meeting together, working through the Quranic passages that relate to the Children's Rights Convention articles, one by one. And they were dialoguing about their meaning. And they were talking to each other. It's Serer, Wolof, Mandinka, Fulani. And they were building up a shared understanding, rooted in their culture and their religion, of what we would call the human rights framework for children as a basis for action. Now that's a practice that empowers, it builds on human assets in ways that disembodied expert-led advocacy does not. And there are things like that. So training trainers in all of the participating methodologies that we learned and then forgot collectively, and ultimately shifting power relationships in policy deliberations, and the idea of building up new shared social norms as extended families and communities are broken apart by globalization, urbanization, mass migration. We move away from the extended family where we hold social norms to these new places where we have to reestablish them with new neighbors, and we can't usually cross-ethnically. So that's one idea here, is this whole idea of the reclaiming the old tried and true ways, but of reasserting these participatory methodologies, community organizing, social norms, dialoguing, building on indigenous knowledge and local values, and building up toward global norms from local norms, so that we gain civic buy-in to a broad common framework that we seek. This is a much longer term game. It's more sustainable, but it's also what, frankly, our antagonists have done well. They have planted seeds of values differently, very deep, and we have to counter them and build them up. The other is the idea of trying to build up shared big pictures of very large synthesized ideas. So we saw OECD's flower, the integration flower image this morning, and then we saw the Canadian feminist development model, the mandala. Right? So here's my version of a lotus. And this is a summary of the SDGs, thinking about a very deep way of describing something very big and multifaceted and complicated, but it's to fire the moral imagination of ourselves. So human development and ecology. So human ecology, our right relationship with the Mother Earth and the planet. So it's sustainability, it's climate change, it's all these things about our disequilibrium with our biosphere. Human development, this idea that education, human capacity building, the deeper purpose, not the mechanistic purpose, are our fundamental underlying values. And then what do they lead to? They lead to now the discourse that dominates, which is prosperity, economic growth, World Bank, OECD, and human security. This is what militaries, this is what policymakers, this is what fearmongers want to talk about. But we have a different idea about how we frame that. And it's a consequence of human ecology thinking, human development values, human dignity at the core, the idea of rights, dignity. And if we just flip to the other picture, so, and this is a feminist view or a soft power view. Here's another way of saying the same thing that you could talk to a military officer. He would like seeing the lotus. But here's the same idea, represented with hard edges, represented as a diamond, tough, hard, forceful, edgy. But it's the same idea that when we root our work in human development and human ecology, thinking and values, centered around human dignity, it leads to human security and human prosperity, but on terms we accept. It's not a trade-off of security versus dignity. where we separate families at a border. It's not human prosperity at the cost of, through austerity, which undermines human development. It's this and picture that's very broad and very deep. So this is my elevator picture everywhere I go. My hope is that these are the kinds of, and this is an example of how to adroitly tell the story differently depending on the audience. Don't lead with a lotus when you're talking to a 3-star general or to a minister of interior of Nigeria who's beset by all these people talking to him about terrorism and about abduction of girls and about, that's the driver of policy discourse in his setting. We have to talk like this. But we have to say, in order to get to that upper right-hand quadrant, what do we have to do? There's a pathway to that. It's a result of things. It's not the thing we start with. You don't do it to the detriment of all the others. You have to do it as in concert with, in balance with the others. So I just leave you with this thought that we need to build together a big counter-narrative to austerity, neoliberalism, scarcity. There's not enough money. There are zillions of dollars in the world. We're not allocating them to human development or to human ecology. We need the moral imagination of leadership to make the case for that. And then we are the ones who know how to interpret that in human development terms, in terms of education that is inclusive, that doesn't undermine human dignity when you swing the gate open. It doesn't exclude people so that it leads to human insecurity. It doesn't exclude large numbers of people who then are not able to contribute to societal prosperity. But we need both a new mega message and narrative that we're all subscribing to and that underpins our very specific advocacy and civil society campaigning work. And we need to re-engage the participatory methodologies that we lost track of on this fast track. Remember the curve of education for all, Kurt-Lewin's warning? He's my elder, one of my big brothers that I learned from, and we all got very excited when Education for All took off. And he's reminding us, oops. By doing that without building civic buy-in and building up together through participatory methodology, Education for All was not a democratic practice. It was a technological fix. And citizens don't buy into that all the way. So there's a different way we have to approach this as civic activists and advocates if we want to move in the direction of these long-term goals and counter the narrative that has shifted our focus from our prefrontal cortex to the Thank you very much.
I'm just going to open it right here.
I have a lot to say, but I'm going to try and edit myself. Bill, your name is?
Michael.